She reached into her pocket, withdrew what anyone else might have assumed was a calculator or some strange sort of television remote. She aimed it at the screen and pressed a series of numbers. Her numbers, which the device would encrypt. Prompted by this transitory code, the bland graphic painted by her organization's master computer vanished, and a series of vague images flittered across the screen, each one colorful, but too quickly gone to be discerned. She listened to the hiss and cries of the machine's electronic dialing, closed her eyes again as she waited, felt the flashes of color washing out over her, cleansing her in electronic light. When the pulses had stopped again, she opened her eyes to find that the machine had squirreled its way along, as it had been taught, through the many points of choice offered in cyberspace, dropping her out precisely where she had left off her normal work only hours before. "I don't work in this room," she thought. "I work out there somewhere, out there in the vast infinity of machine space." Her machine sat quietly now, its screen bathing her in a film of deeper blue, and she imagined that she could feel the light's cool touch as she pulled the ties of her robe loose and sat down before the machine to take a different path. "You feel more comfortable here?" he asked her, and she found herself nodding in response. But it was a question pulsing before her on the computer screen after all. She glanced across the dimly lit room to the door of her office. Locked. Yes, she had locked the door. Of course she had. She smiled at herself as she hurried to tap out her response. "Is here in Norway?" She watched her own message unfurl below his question, tiny electronic characters laid out against the dark blue of computer space. "Yes, I think Norway," came his answer. "Well, it seems very warm in Norway," she typed. It was true. She felt a thin trickle of sweat inching its way down the flesh just in front of her ear. Another time she might have brushed it away in annoyance. Now it felt like a tiny finger tracing its way down toward her throat, toward the plane of her chest. She willed it on its way, and her breasts tightened in response. "And how is the situation of your work?" she read. A tick of sound from somewhere, she thought. But it was just nerves, her imagination. "I am still deciding," she replied. "Such disillusionment. Maybe the best thing is to leave, but time will tell." Then she added, "I don't want to talk about work tonight, please. I am feeling too comfortable now." "Ah, good," was his response. She murmured a prayer of thanks. In fact, she was greatly distressed about the situation of her work. But she was determined to bury her feelings, for tonight at least. As their scheduled day and time had neared, she found herself burning with anticipation, and she did not want anything to spoil it. The suspicion that her passions might possibly have risen in direct response to the greater urgencies in her life had occurred to her, but she did not care. Comfort was where you could find it, she had decided, and nothing was going to deter her from that tonight. Besides, the fact was that she did feel more comfortable here, in this new meeting place. They had met in a much different arena, online as it was referred to, in one of the chat groups on the internet. Nothing like alt.sex.bondage, of course, but one of the more innocuous ones, where she had been lurking quietly in the background, keeping an eye out, not for cybermates, but for lost souls who might profit by what her organization might provide. She had read about all these groups. What better source of converts? How patronizing she had been, she thought now. Torsten, his name, and though it bespoke of Scandinavian open-mindedness, even sexual brazenness and amorality, she'd been touched by the innocence of the messages he had sent when he'd first appeared online. "I am new to this," he'd said. "I am alone, but not lonely." These messages popping onto her screen interspersed into the chat of 3 women complaining about the rudeness of men they'd met online. "I am being amazed at how the world has changed to allow such a thing as this." She'd read that and more, and finally felt somehow so taken by this Torsten, whom the other 3 steadfastly ignored, that she'd found herself tapping out her first truly personal message in response, surprised by how her fingers trembled as she pressed the keys. Things had progressed rapidly with Torsten, and beyond her wildest imaginings. She knew it was partly to be accounted for by her own loneliness. She hadn't had what might be termed a date for more than a year, having come to prefer the predictable, low-grade boredom of her own company to the inevitable disappointment she'd become accustomed to in her relationships, the last, of course, worst of all. There were men around, other men in the organization, of course, and she hadn't sworn off them, but the organization was growing so rapidly and the responsibilities of her position had increased, and she felt that she'd needed no distractions, not for a while at least. And somehow the weeks had become months, and those had strung together into a year or more. And then, suddenly, there had come Torsten from nowhere, or from out of cyberspace to be more exact. They had discovered common interests in reading, biographies and histories primarily, in cooking, the medium-fat diet, and a little wine never hurt anyone. In thinking, how vast the world had become with these machines leading the way, how difficult it seemed to feel an important part of things. She could have him on her terms, or on equal terms at least, no more at the mercy of his whims as to when to be together than he was at hers. Though they had shared vague physical descriptions, she had subtracted a few pounds from her true weight, and 5 years had somehow vanished from her age. He, on the other hand, had called himself a better-looking Sigmund Freud. She was free to imagine him physically as she preferred, these imaginings becoming steadily more intense, and she was free to speak with him without fear, for she was ultimately just a few letters and symbols, as ultimately untraceable by him as he was by her. And though it had been Torsten to guide them gently out of the common group where they had met and into a private room where they could talk more intimately, she'd soon discovered a latent desire to speak openly of things she'd barely allowed herself to think about, much less express. At first, he'd questioned her about her work. He was an accountant in a large city, and though he'd never said, something in his odd syntax suggested it was in some European country. Her upbringing, his a pastiche of anonymous boarding schools, exact locales unnamed, hers inconsequential, in a city of the American South, she'd told him, and never said how far south, nor how misleading that expression was in her case. In the beginning, she'd been extraordinarily cautious, as if any chance details she might let slip would lead to this unknown man tracking her down across continents. Perhaps she'd come home late from work one night to find a sex fiend, a killer slavering in the bushes by her doorstep. But little by little she'd lost her reserve. He had become her friend after all, and she had begun to confide in him. At first, she shared the vaguest hints of her unease about her job, and then, at his gentle prodding, we all have passed through these periods of doubt about what we do. She'd confessed graver concerns. She told him nothing specific, of course, but spoke of matters she had discovered that, if not outright criminal, at the least seemed at odds with the very mission of their organization. In this New World Order, he'd tried to reassure her, perhaps what seems untoward is just the way of business. No, she'd told him. She knew the difference between matters of simple exigency and what was downright wrong. Was there no one she could talk to about these matters? Torsten had asked. No, she told him. There was no one. Of course, that was not exactly true. There was one person, and she had taken certain steps. but she had not seen